I am a virus. Chapter 2, Painful Reflections 2, The Inevitability of Viral Spread. Over the past decade, in the face of China's so-called economic miracle, convincing people around me that autocracy is inherently an evil system has proven exceedingly difficult. I have repeatedly explained that while authoritarian systems may demonstrate a certain efficiency in areas like infrastructure development, such efficiency is built upon severe violations of human rights, such as forced land seizures and demolitions. However, as long as such violations do not affect them directly, the vast majority of Chinese people tend to accept the rationale that sacrificing individual interests for the sake of the greater good is justified. In my view, this mindset represents one of the toxic elements embedded within Chinese culture. In these discussions, I often present another argument: authoritarian systems are highly efficient at perpetrating wrongdoing and severely lack mechanisms for correction, rendering the entire society powerless to intervene. Consider, for example, the Great Leap Forward of the 1950s, the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s and 1970s, and the one-child policy of the 1980s. In fact, since 1949, almost none of the major policies implemented by this system have been correct, inflicting enduring, irreversible, and even irreparable harm on the Chinese people. Unfortunately, these arguments often fall flat for most Chinese citizens because they will tell me, "Look forward, not back. I didn't live through those times." Many people, having not personally experienced these events, even question their authenticity. Even if they believe them to be true, they simply shrug it off, claiming, "It's in the past, we live in the present." Today, many people point to China's growing strength and their increasingly full pockets as evidence of satisfaction. Some have even begun to mock the perceived inefficiencies of Western democracies, while unscrupulous scholars actively promote the China model. Whether these scholars genuinely believe in it or are merely pandering to the government is difficult to discern. Sitting in the epicenter of the COVID-19 disaster, I have found myself harboring an inhumane thought, hoping that this catastrophe might serve as a wake-up call for all Chinese people. The outbreak of this pandemic, much like the nucleic acid test strips we have been preoccupied with, rapidly revealed that this seemingly strong authoritarian system is riddled with weaknesses and fraught with dangers. This is especially evident since Xi Jinping consolidated power under the guise of anti-corruption. Local officials, fearing mistakes and punishment, report only good news while concealing bad, leading to frequent, systemic falsification. When the outbreak began, Wuhan's government instinctively sought to cover up and delay responses. As the crisis escalated, their deference to central command was a standard authoritarian maneuver. Had the virus not been both highly contagious and resistant to treatment, local officials might have once again successfully muddled through. This pandemic will eventually pass, but it remains an undeniable fact that the authoritarian system missed a critical window for epidemic control. The lives of countless innocent citizens are irretrievably lost, but as long as this system remains unchanged, the next crisis is bound to spiral out of control in a similar fashion. Clearly, this is not merely a failure of epidemic prevention but a systemic failure of authoritarian rule. Examples abound: the 1930s famine in Ukraine, the 1960s Chinese Great Famine, the 1986 Chernobyl disaster, the 2008 Wenchuan earthquake, and the 2019 African swine fever outbreak in China. The authoritarian system has never successfully managed a sudden major disaster. In a certain sense, the emergence of disasters itself is inevitable under such a regime. Renowned Chinese economist Mao Yuxi once remarked that since Deng Xiaoping's era, the scale of unnatural deaths in China has been much smaller compared to Mao Zedong's era because the intensity of authoritarian control was lower, giving society some space to self-correct and modestly enhancing its capacity to respond to sudden disasters. Today, many Chinese citizens take pride in what they perceive as the primary strength of an authoritarian system, concentrating resources to accomplish major projects, such as the Beijing Olympics, the nationwide high-speed rail network, and the skyscrapers of Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Shenzhen. Many foreigners, too, admire these achievements. However, upon closer examination, all these so-called major accomplishments are tied to the security and prestige of the Communist Party's rule. Public affairs unrelated to the party's survival, such as public health, healthcare, and citizen education, receive far less attention and management. This explains why, despite being the world's second-largest economy, China struggles to address issues related to social security, healthcare, and other matters of widespread public interest despite consistently high tax rates and steadily growing fiscal revenues. When faced with the mockery of democracy's inefficiency, I often respond, while democracies may be less efficient, they avoid catastrophic mistakes, and even when they err, they have mechanisms for correction. The strength of democratic elections lies not in guaranteeing the selection of the best leader but in ensuring the removal of poor leaders, allowing others to take over. An authoritarian system offers no such recourse, citizens can only endure and wait. To prove its legitimacy, an authoritarian government conceals and covers up its mistakes whenever possible. As a result, every mistake, when left unchecked, is destined to escalate into a disaster. Nobel laureate and famine researcher Amartya Sen made a famous assertion in 1982, "No famine has ever taken place in the history of the world in a functioning democracy with a relatively free press." The COVID-19 outbreak in Wuhan can be considered a natural disaster, but its rapid spread was unquestionably a man-made catastrophe. Under long-term authoritarian rule, society's immunity has been severely weakened, and each of us, as part of this society, contributes to this weakened state. Throughout the evolution of this epidemic, and even to this day, the authoritarian system's control over information has never ceased, continuing to ruthlessly attack and damage society's immunity. The spread of this virus and the potential for future outbreaks are both inevitable outcomes of this weakened social immunity. It is no secret that every frontline doctor involved in combating the pandemic was forced to sign a confidentiality agreement. Clearly, the system learned from the SARS incident. The unexpected exposure of SARS happened because Dr. Zhang Yuniang leaked information to foreign media. Rather than learning from SARS by promoting transparency, the authoritarian system doubled down on information control. No major disaster occurs without warning signs. In the early stages of this pandemic, frontline doctors at Wuhan's Tongji, Zihe, and Xinhua hospitals all noticed the unusual nature of the illness from their patient cases. Some medical staff even became infected, and they were well aware of human-to-human transmission. The 8 doctors who were reprimanded had, in fact, already been extremely compliant due to the confidentiality agreements. They were merely attempting to warn their colleagues within a narrow circle out of professional conscience. This weak resistance within a society with poor immunity was ultimately crushed by the authoritarian system, resulting in yet another lost opportunity for self-rescue. With every suppressed warning, the public's innocent lives are sacrificed even more gravely. Sadly, COVID-19 still has no specific cure, and individuals must rely on their own immunity to fight it off. The same principle applies to society. Under authoritarian rule, societal immunity is steadily eroded, but we remain oblivious until a crisis strikes. When the virus hit Wuhan, every resident reflected on and scrutinized their own immunity, hoping to get through the crisis unscathed. Yet immunity cannot be built overnight. During Xi Jinping's rule, the tightening of centralized control and government expansion has made many Chinese increasingly dependent on and even trusting of the government. When the occasional whistleblower tries to critique the government's regression, their voice is quickly silenced. Ironically, even many vulnerable citizens regard government criticism as disruptive noise. Over the years, China's societal immunity has rapidly deteriorated. The intensity of this pandemic, especially the nature of the virus, has caused widespread panic, leading many to lose faith in the government. But when viewed against the backdrop of China's history since 1949, even greater disasters have occurred repeatedly, and the myth of this regime should have shattered long ago. The flaws of authoritarianism should have long since been laid bare. Why, then, do people so quickly return to blind faith and dependence on the government after each crisis? The phrase "forgetting pain once the wound heals" is familiar to every Chinese citizen, but I believe this is not the crux of the problem. The real issue lies in a society with weakened immunity and a reliance on external support. What's more concerning is that many people do not even realize their own lack of immunity, nor do they have the motivation to strengthen it. This time, only Wuhan residents, driven by fear, have acutely realized the importance of immunity. Others in China may care, but certainly not to the same extent. Therefore, I remain deeply pessimistic about China's ability to avoid the next epidemic from spiraling out of control.